Stop for a moment and really think about what I'm about to tell you, because it sounds like the beginning of a conspiracy theory, but it is actually a sequence of documented events that happened right in front of us over the last few years, and almost nobody connected the dots in real time. In March of 2020, the Federal Reserve created $4 trillion in just 8 weeks. In 2021, the United States government mailed stimulus checks to millions of people, including many who never lost their jobs. In 2020, Russia was suddenly locked out of the global SWIFT banking network after invading Ukraine, which effectively weaponized the global financial system overnight. In 2023, China and Brazil quietly began settling major trade deals in their own currencies instead of using the dollar. In 2020, central banks around the world bought more gold than at any point since the 1950s. And now in early 2026, the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond is higher than it was during the worst moment of the inflation crisis, which forces us to ask a question that almost nobody on television is willing to ask out loud. And that question is this: at what point does a normal recession stop being the thing we should worry about and the real story become the possibility that the entire global system of money itself is quietly changing underneath us? I am not here to sell fear. I am not here to tell you to buy canned food and hide in a bunker. And I am definitely not here to pitch some overpriced financial course about surviving the collapse of civilization, because the truth is much more subtle and much more interesting than that. And the reason I am talking about this at all is because over the last few months I did something very few people actually take the time to do, which is that I went directly to the primary sources that institutional investors use when they try to understand macroeconomic transitions. Reading IMF working papers about reserve currency history, reading the dense Bank for International Settlements reports that almost nobody outside central banking circles ever finishes because they're 800 pages long and written in language that feels like a legal contract between economists, reading the actual filings and strategy notes from major hedge funds that manage tens of billions of dollars, and the conclusion that started forming after weeks of reading was not that we are heading toward a normal recession, but that we may be entering something far more structural, which is a transition in the underlying rules of the global financial system. To make this easier to understand, imagine the global financial system as if it were a gigantic apartment complex where every major country signed a lease with the same landlord after World War II. And in this metaphor, the landlord of that building was the United States. Well, the lease agreement was extremely simple and extremely powerful because the world agreed that the US dollar would become the global reserve currency, which meant that oil, commodities, international debt, and most global trade would be priced and settled in dollars, while in exchange, the United States promised to maintain a relatively stable currency, keep inflation under control, and provide enough military power to guarantee that the global trade routes connecting all those tenants remained open and secure. For almost 80 years, that agreement worked remarkably well, because the United States had the largest industrial economy in the world, the deepest capital markets, and the most powerful military infrastructure ever built, which meant that holding dollars was not only convenient but often necessary if you wanted to participate in the global economy. Yet the problem with very long leases is that eventually, the landlord begins pushing the limits of what tenants will tolerate, and eventually those tenants start quietly exploring whether there might be other apartments available somewhere else. One of the earliest moments where the terms of that lease quietly changed happened in 1971, when President Richard Nixon closed what was known as the gold window, which ended the direct convertibility of the US dollar into gold. And while that decision did not seem catastrophic at the time, it fundamentally transformed the nature of the dollar, because from that moment forward, the currency of the world's largest economy was no longer backed by a tangible asset, but instead by trust in the economic and political stability of the United States itself. And for decades, the trust held because the US economy was dominant, and global demand for dollars remained overwhelming. But trust, unlike gold or land or oil, is a psychological asset that slowly erodes when it is stretched afar. And if we are being intellectually honest, we have to acknowledge that the modern financial system has been stretching that trust repeatedly for the last 15 years in ways that previous generations would have considered unimaginable. Consider the current level of US national debt, which now sits around $36 trillion, a number so large that it almost loses meaning unless you compare it to the size of the American economy itself. Because when economists talk about debt sustainability, they usually compare government debt to GDP, which represents the country's annual economic output, and by that measure the United States now carries a debt load that exceeds 120% of its GDP, which means that if the government were a household earning $60,000 per year, it would effectively be carrying more than $70,000 of credit card debt. Some people respond to this statistic by pointing out that the United States also had very high debt after World War II, which is true, but the context then was dramatically different because the post-war United States had a young and rapidly growing population, a massive domestic manufacturing base, and the unique position of being the primary creditor nation financing reconstruction across the rest of the developed world. Whereas today the United States has an aging demographic profile, a heavily financialized economy with much of its manufacturing offshored, and a fiscal system that increasingly borrows money simply to pay the interest on money that has already been borrowed. When financial systems reach that stage, they often face a psychological fork in the road, where policymakers must either admit that the structure is unsustainable and begin the painful process of restructuring debt and spending, or they attempt to extend the life of the system by continuously finding new buyers for the debt that keeps the machine running. And for the last decade and a half, one of the largest buyers of that debt has effectively been the Federal Reserve itself, which steps into the bond market whenever interest rates start rising too quickly and purchases government bonds, using newly created money in a process economists politely call debt monetization, but ordinary people recognize as inflation. That strategy works as long as global demand for dollars remains strong. But the second major force that destabilizes long-standing monetary systems is the internal social imbalance that emerges when wealth inequality reaches extreme levels, because societies under severe inequality often experience political turbulence, which in turn makes investors less comfortable holding long-term government debt issued by that society. The numbers here are startling because by 2020, for the top 1% of Americans, controlled roughly 30% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% controlled only about 2%, which creates a distribution gap even wider than the one that existed before the Great Depression. And while inequality alone does not automatically collapse a financial system, it creates the political pressures that can eventually lead to unpredictable policy decisions, and unpredictability is exactly what long-term investors fear most when deciding whether to lend money to governments. For 10 or 20 years, when investors begin worrying about political instability or fiscal sustainability, they often respond by shifting capital into assets that exist outside the direct control of any single government, which historically has meant things like gold, land, energy resources, and other forms of real value that cannot be printed into existence with a keyboard command inside a central bank computer. That helps explain why central banks around the world have dramatically increased their gold purchases in recent years, with more than 1,000 tons of gold acquired in 2020 for a loan by countries including China, Russia, India, and Turkey. And it is important to understand that central banks do not make decisions like this based on emotion or internet rumors, but rather through long-term strategic planning about what kind of monetary environment might exist 10 or 20 years from now. At the same time, another powerful force has been reshaping the financial landscape, which is geopolitical conflict. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and was removed from the SWIFT payment network, it demonstrated to every government on earth that the international financial system could be used as a strategic weapon. And the moment a payment system becomes a weapon, every potential target immediately begins exploring alternatives that would allow them to conduct trade without depending on that system. This is why we have seen Russia and China expanding the use of their own currencies in bilateral trade, why India has experimented with purchasing oil using rupees, why China and Brazil announced agreements to settle certain transactions directly in yuan and reais, and why even some oil-producing nations in the Middle East have started discussing the possibility of pricing energy exports in multiple currencies instead of exclusively in dollars. None of these changes destroy the dollar overnight, because monetary systems rarely collapse in dramatic Hollywood fashion, but they slowly chip away at the monopoly power that once made the dollar unavoidable for global commerce. To understand why this matters for ordinary people, imagine a 42-year-old professional named David who earns about $110,000 per year and has managed to accumulate roughly $350,000 in his retirement account, which is invested in a typical target date fund that automatically adjusts its stock and bond allocation as he ages. Every retirement calculator David has ever used confidently tells him that if he continues contributing 6% of his salary while receiving a modest employer match, he will likely retire around age 65 with approximately $1.8 million in savings, which sounds extremely reassuring until you examine the assumptions hidden inside those projections. Those projections assume long-term stock market returns averaging around 7% annually, inflation averaging roughly 2.5% per year, and the purchasing power of the dollar remaining relatively stable over the next 20 years. But if the global monetary system is entering a period of transition, those assumptions may no longer hold in the way previous generations expected. Imagine inflation averaging closer to 5% over the next 2 decades, while investment returns become more volatile due to higher interest rates and geopolitical instability. Because in that scenario, David might still retire with a portfolio statement showing $1.8 million, yet the real purchasing power of that money could resemble what $800,000 buys today. The number on the screen would look impressive, but the lifestyle it supports would feel dramatically different from the one he imagined while planning his retirement. And that is the subtle danger of monetary transitions, because they rarely feel like sudden catastrophes, but rather like slow erosion that compounds over many years. Your grocery bill rises slightly faster than expected each year. Housing costs climb gradually. Financial markets deliver more uneven returns. And before anyone realizes what has happened, an entire decade of compounding has unfolded under economic conditions very different from the assumptions used when the financial plans were first created. This is why the most important skill in long-term investing is not simply choosing stocks, but understanding which macroeconomic game you are playing, and recognizing when the rules of that game begin shifting beneath the surface, because many investors are still operating under the assumptions that define the financial environment between roughly 1985 and 2020, when inflation was relatively low, interest rates were falling, government bonds behaved as safe assets, and the US dollar faced little serious competition as the backbone of global trade. If the world is gradually moving into a different environment where debt levels are higher, geopolitical blocks are more fragmented, and alternative payment systems are emerging alongside the traditional dollar network, then portfolios designed for the old environment may require adjustment simply to maintain their intended level of resilience. For some investors, that adjustment might involve holding a broader mix of assets, including commodities or precious metals. For others, it might involve reducing exposure to very long-term bonds that lose value when interest rates rise. And for many people, it simply means acknowledging that the future may not resemble the financial history of the last 40 years. History shows that reserve currencies do change over time, because before the dollar dominated global finance, the British pound played that role during the height of the British Empire. Before that, the Dutch guilder was central to European trade during the Dutch Golden Age, and before that, various silver-based systems anchored the commerce of earlier centuries. None of those transitions occurred overnight, and none involved the immediate collapse of the previous system. Yet over decades, the balance of power slowly shifted as new economic centers emerged, and new financial infrastructures developed to support them. That historical pattern suggests that what we may be witnessing today is not a sudden financial apocalypse, but the early stages of another long transition in the architecture of global money, a process that unfolds quietly while most people remain focused on the daily noise of markets and headlines. And the real risk in such moments is not panic but complacency, because the most dangerous assumption any investor can make is believing that the financial rules shaping the present moment will remain unchanged for the next 30 years simply because they have felt stable for the last 30. The future rarely moves in straight lines, and the systems we rely on often evolve gradually, until one day we realize the world we planned for has subtly transformed into something new. And those who recognized the shift early had time to adapt, while those who assumed nothing would change are left wondering why the numbers in their accounts no longer buy the life they once expected. Now imagine continuing that same story a few years into the future, because the most important thing to understand about massive financial transitions is that they rarely arrive with a dramatic headline announcing that the old system has officially ended and the new one has begun. Instead, they unfold through a series of subtle signals that only make sense in hindsight once enough time has passed for people to recognize the pattern that was quietly forming in the background, while everyone was still arguing about the latest quarterly earnings report or the next election cycle. Think about how slowly human perception adapts to gradual change. Because if the price of groceries doubled overnight, people would immediately panic and demand answers. Yet if those same prices rise 5% every year, the increase feels manageable in the moment, even though after 15 years the total cost of living has effectively doubled, while wages and investment returns struggle to keep pace with the silent compounding pressure. This is precisely how monetary transitions reshape entire societies, without triggering an instant sense of crisis, because people experience the change not as a single shocking event, but as a long series of small adjustments that slowly alter the financial landscape in ways that become obvious only when someone steps back and looks at the entire arc of the transformation. Consider what happens when interest rates remain elevated for an extended period of time in a world where governments are already carrying historically high levels of debt, because every percentage point increase in borrowing costs forces governments to allocate larger portions of their budget simply to service existing obligations rather than investing in infrastructure, education, or long-term economic growth. When that dynamic persists year after year, it creates a feedback loop where policymakers face increasingly uncomfortable trade-offs between raising taxes, cutting spending, or quietly allowing inflation to erode the real value of the debt. And historically, most governments eventually choose the inflationary path because it spreads the burden across the entire population in a way that feels less politically explosive than direct austerity measures. Yet inflation itself has profound psychological effects on economic behavior, because once people begin expecting prices to rise faster in the future, they naturally accelerate their spending today, which can push prices even higher while simultaneously discouraging long-term saving in traditional fixed-income assets. That shift in expectation slowly changes how businesses plan investments, how workers negotiate wages, and how households allocate their savings between cash, stocks, real estate, and alternative assets that might better preserve purchasing power during uncertain monetary conditions. Over time, the collective effect of millions of these individual decisions begins reshaping financial markets in ways that traditional models struggle to capture, because those models often assume relatively stable macroeconomic conditions that no longer exist during periods of structural transition. This is one reason why large institutional investors pay so much attention to historical case studies of previous reserve currency transitions, studying how the Dutch guilder gradually lost influence during the 18th century as Britain's financial markets expanded, or how the British pound slowly yielded global dominance to the US dollar during the first half of the 20th century as economic power shifted across the Atlantic. In each of those historical examples, the transition occurred not because the old system suddenly collapsed, but because the emerging system offered advantages that gradually attracted more participants until the balance of global finance had quietly tilted in a new direction. For modern investors, the difficult challenge is recognizing that such transitions rarely follow a clean or predictable timeline, because political decisions, technological breakthroughs, and unforeseen global events can accelerate or delay the process in ways that no single model can forecast with precision. For example, the rapid development of digital payment networks and blockchain-based financial infrastructure has introduced entirely new possibilities for how international transactions might be settled in the future, potentially reducing the dependence on traditional banking intermediaries that historically reinforced the dominance of established reserve currencies. At the same time, central banks themselves are experimenting with digital versions of their national currencies, known as central bank digital currencies, which could eventually allow governments to settle cross-border payments more efficiently while maintaining tighter control over domestic monetary policy. Whether these technologies ultimately reinforce the existing financial order or contribute to a more multipolar system where several major currencies share global influence remains an open question that economists and policymakers are actively debating today. What is clear, however, is that technological change tends to interact with geopolitical competition in ways that accelerate institutional innovation. Whenever major powers perceive strategic advantages in building alternative systems that reduce dependence on their rivals, we have already seen glimpses of this dynamic as countries explore regional payment networks, bilateral trade agreements denominated in local currencies, and commodity exchanges that allow energy producers to price contracts outside the traditional dollar-based infrastructure. None of these developments individually overturns the current system, yet together they create a growing web of alternatives that gradually lowers the barrier for countries seeking greater monetary independence. For individual savers and investors, the practical implication is not that they must predict exactly which currency or asset class will dominate the next generation of global finance, but rather that maintaining flexibility and diversification becomes increasingly valuable in an environment where the future path of the monetary system is less certain than it appeared during the relatively stable decades following the Cold War. This might mean allocating savings across a wider range of asset classes, maintaining exposure to productive businesses capable of adapting to different economic conditions, and continuously updating one's understanding of the macroeconomic forces shaping long-term investment outcomes. Another important consideration involves the role of demographics in shaping economic growth, because many advanced economies are entering periods of slower population expansion and aging workforces, which can reduce the natural momentum of economic activity unless offset by technological productivity gains or immigration policies that expand the labor pool. Demographic transitions also influence government finances, because older populations typically require higher spending on healthcare and retirement benefits, while contributing relatively less in payroll taxes compared with younger working cohorts. If those demographic pressures coincide with high levels of public debt and persistent geopolitical competition, they can further complicate the policy decisions facing governments attempting to balance economic stability with long-term fiscal sustainability.